Thank you all for sticking it out and staying here to allow me to present some of my work from a book manuscript that I'm finishing up called Accountability in Unexpected Places, Democratic Practices in African Slums. As Rob has already shown us today, the world is undergoing this process of urbanization where by 2050, approximately 70% of the world is going to be living in urban areas. And in Africa, this challenge is happening very rapidly as well. And the urban population continues to grow in very big numbers, so much that there's this transformation of African societies from a majority rural continent to a majority urban one. And in Ghana, where I do my research, this transformation has largely taken place and is continuing to take place. So between 1990 and 2010, the urban population has grown from 4 to 14 million. But what this means is that people are moving to cities, and the cities do not have the resources and do not have the jobs to really take in this large migrant population. So what this means is that most of these people are living in slum-like conditions. So the estimates in Ghana is that 5.5 million people live in slum-like conditions, and I think this number is probably a low number. It's probably much, much higher. And what we notice is that these spaces, these slum populations, have become a new space of politics. So many of these people are coming from marginalized parts of the country, and they come to the city, particularly in the capital cities, and place new pressures on the state and place new demands. And there are also these areas that are of huge interest to social scientists. So they have high ethnic diversity, really weak institutions, and high levels of poverty. And I think understanding how cooperation and politics works in these communities can really help us understand some of the crucial social science questions that we look at in other contexts. And then finally, there's a policy goal here. And Sustainable Development Goal 11 suggests that we need to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And this forces us to look at these spaces of politics. But we know very little about what is actually going on in these communities. So when I set out to do my research, I did ethnographic research for a year in 3 Ghanaian settlements. And every day I would eat lunch just behind this sewer. And a few weeks into my research, I realized something pretty obvious here, is that there's open sewers, and the sewers are completely full. And what this contributes to is, as you notice, after a big storm, incredible flooding, but also high levels of bacteria and high levels of diseases like cholera. But a few weeks later, when I was in another one of the communities that I was working in, I noticed something very different. So even though there isn't a formal gutter here, a formal sewer, every morning, informal trash collector would come by, clean out the sewers, place the garbage on the side of the sewer, and then that afternoon, a kayabola, another informal trash collector, would come by and bring it to the nearby resource dump. And what was particularly surprising was that in both of these slums, they're highly poor, highly ethnically diverse, and but in this community, the community was able to come together and clean the sewers themselves, while in the first community, they could not. And this simple variation really did shapes the research question in the book that I am working on. And what I find is that development things like cleaning sewers is an inherently political process. So I'm trained as a political scientist, and it was very clear to me early on that all of these had local power dynamics. So you can see the struggle for basic goods and services across the continent really is a political struggle. In South Africa, people take to the streets to demand better sanitation. Sanitation is dignity. In the bottom left corner, residents of Kibera deal with the problem of flying toilets, which is little baggies thrown into nearby ravines. And then in the right picture here are a public toilet in Ghana. And these public toilets are so contentious because contracts are provided to local party leaders to manage these public toilets, and they've become so contentious in local discourse that they're called toilet wars. And what I try to do in this project is really try to understand why why some communities are able to come together, manage their sewers, while others are not. And it's not just sewers, but things like streetlights, things like roads, things like public toilets. But one of the biggest challenges is putting these communities on the map. So many of these communities are off the map, so to speak. They're informal settlements. So I had to create some of the maps myself and collect my own original data. So if we step back for a second and try to think about how a city might be governed, there are some potential explanations given to us by the political science framework. So the international community provides some, the international community provides some resources and guidelines in how to manage resources. So there's organizations like Slum Dweller International, UN Habitat, but on the ground they have very little impact, I found. The state also has certain rules and guidelines on how to take care of their cities, but what we notice is that at the municipal level and at the community level, people like mayors are actual political appointees. So in Ghana, for example, the mayor is not democratically elected by the people, but rather appointed by the president, so which creates a certain logic into who gets certain formal resources and these types of things. So what's really important is how a community is governed at the local level, and this includes how people like chiefs, pastors, landlords, and other important opinion leaders come together to clean their communities. And just to give you an example of how important this is in local discourse, in this picture here, you see two important gentlemen who are out on a communal labor exercise. The guy on the left is President John Mahama, and the guy on the right is the mayor, Alfred Vanderpoy. And what this suggests is that leaders are really expected to bring people together to take care of their community. In fact, there's a day dedicated each year to cleaning up your neighborhood called Sanitation Day. So what I find in the book and what I present is that there's three major, I have three major findings for what kind of explains these positive governance outcomes. The first is that the way in which a slum was settled really shapes the governance patterns. So I explain different settlement patterns over the course of the book. And what this does is it shapes a different logic of how state resources are distributed. So in certain slum communities, state resources are treated as public goods. In other communities, they're treated as private goods. And in a third type of community, they're treated as club goods. So for example, if a community gets a public toilet, the way in which that public toilet is governed depends on certain settlement types. So in a community that's a squatter settlement and an extra legal settlement, the toilets are really governed on private lines in order to increase the personal power of a certain leader. Whereas in other types of communities, they're treated much more along public and club lines. The second major factor that matters is accountable leadership. And an important factor that I found is how accessible the community leaders and the local formal representatives are in the community. So one of the things that I'm doing in the work is I've expanded the scope of the study to a quantitative survey, and I'm looking at whether local leaders live in the community. And I find that leaders that live in the community are much more likely to lead to good development outcomes, like having their streetlights. And the logic for this is very simple. So when I was interviewing a local leader, we were having a long discussion about how he governs his community, and I looked behind him, and there's a stack of streetlights. And I asked him, I said, sir, why do you, you have a box of streetlights there. Did the municipal assembly buy those for you? And he said, he laughed at me like it was a stupid question. He said, no. I bought those streetlights myself. And I said, why would you buy them yourself when the municipal assembly is supposed to provide these streetlights for you? He said, they won't do it. And if I don't buy them, I'm going to have a line of people out the door until 4 in the morning begging on my door, and I won't even sleep. And it's simple things like this, the face-to-face accessibility of leaders in these communities that really shape certain development outcomes. And in the book that I'm working on, I call these informal practices of accountability that bring us past more formal practices. And then finally, I find that cross-ethnic social engagement really helps the ability of a community to govern themselves. And what this means is that people from different ethnic groups engage in daily practices like funerals, weddings, and something as simple as eating together, which really lends allows us to go one step further than just saying ethnic diversity gets in the way of cooperation, but in places where ethnically diverse people are able to come together in daily activities, it can help us help keep the community clean, which leads to better governance as a whole. So I guess the major conclusions of this is that we need to start thinking about these slum communities rather instead of as an urban crisis, but rather as a political opportunity for certain leaders. Second is this forces us to move beyond planning. So things like formalization and infrastructure investments are insufficient if the local community cannot take care of the infrastructure themselves. So for example, in the first picture of the sewer, a built sewer is only as good as a clean sewer. And then finally, this suggests that we need political solutions rather than just technocratic or bureaucratic solutions. Thank you.
So the way the schedule is supposed to work, we'll have questions for all the speakers now, and you're all supposed to come up to the front and sit here. I'm assuming that there are questions for not just this speaker, but for others. If not, there are. Okay. So questions for Jeff?
Questions?
Do you have a sense of, from going to these different communities and looking at different leaderships, like incentives for leaders to live in their own communities and be responsible for that? Because I imagine you'd sort of want to run away from that responsibility to some degree.
Yeah, of course. So the argument that I make really depends on the way in which a community was settled. So there are certain communities where people migrated in the 1960s and 1970s, and they're considered legitimate communities by the broader host population. And this creates an incentive for local leaders to take care of the people who are already there in order to gain a political following. Whereas in new squatter settlements, what we notice is that the leaders, they use the squatter settlement as a way to kind of bolster their own personal power. But because many of these squatter settlements are not legally recognized by the host city, they're not able to actually run for political office in the host city. So they're using this territory and these opportunities as a way to gain power, but then maybe run for political office back home, like in their northern highland. So there's definitely different incentives depending on how the different community was settled. And it kind of follows these lines of whether you're going to take care of your co-ethnics, other people from your own ethnic group, whether you're going to create a broad-based ethnic coalition with people from different groups, or whether you're going to really just look out for your private interests.
So I had a question for Shauna that Jeff may have already asked, and I didn't understand the answer. I thought that when the sort of people you were describing produce the sort of crops that can be grown under drip irrigation, they're often called cash crops, and to realize the cash, there has to be a market. Mm-hmm. And second, the whole idea is to sell them and not to use them themselves for their own nutrition, or maybe only partly. So how do you, in your experiment, how do you keep them out of the market so that there's a spillover of benefits to others?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things is it really depends on the crop. Like I mentioned, for the model site, they actually all grew onions, the entire farmers group, and then that flooded the market. But from a nutrition perspective, we wouldn't really generally encourage you to consume a huge amount of onions. I think what really, I think the way the project could improve nutrition outcomes is through the income pathway. I don't think it's actually going to be through the crops that they're producing. I think it will mainly be through having a higher income and being able to purchase more nutrient-dense foods. For example, more meat. And that's really particularly important for young children. And because there's such high anemia rates, it becomes even more important.
Okay, so that's sort of the more traditional way of thinking about what those...
But it depends. Like if they were growing leafy greens, which are high in iron, then it would be good if they were consuming some of them within the household. But it really depends on the decision of what crops they're producing. And we don't know whether or not we'll be able to influence that at all.
But if they do that and they only consume some of it and the rest of it goes to the market, and that people in the control group might buy
Exactly. See, this is the problem with these studies, because it's real life, and it's the reality is that the villages aren't so far apart from each other, so there will be a control group that likely shares the same market as the experimental group. But at least we're trying to capture changes in the market as well to see if these foods that are healthier, for example, are more available after the intervention. But it's good points. But it just, it's kind of difficult.
Right, and if they'll be chosen, if they're new, people might not. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, good.
Thanks. I have a question for Justin. I was just wondering if you are aware of how many of these kinds of experiments where you're trying to sample trying to get the internal variability, how many of those have been done with how many models, or if that's something we might see in CMIP6 as like a kind of more established method, or is that very new?
That's a really good question. To the first part of the question about how many exist, I think I know of 2 definitely that had, well, 3, but 2 of them are with the same model of different generations. So there's a 40-member ensemble with a community climate system model version 4, CCSM4, and then there's the 30-member ensemble with the CESM. And then I believe ECM has a like a 50-member ensemble or something like that. I know that Dahi Stone at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is running 100-member ensembles, but looking kind of inspired by monsoon variability. Yeah, it gets at a really sensitive question about computational resources, right? Higher resolutions versus more realizations. And that trade-off kind of gets evaluated by each modeling center. And I think, while CMIP is great in allowing for intermodal comparison, I think the dictates that could come up on high from the World Climate Research Program, which administers CMIP. I think that each center's kind of modeling realities needs to determine where they put their resources. GFDL, for example, which is at Princeton, is invariably focusing on higher and higher resolutions and model complexity. And so I actually think that kind of a plurality of approaches both are really important for model evaluation and model improvement, because we don't know the extent to which that range of outcomes, which is the model's irreducible prediction uncertainty, is actually representative of real-world uncertainty in a forced climate. And I think you can only kind of come at an answer through a triangulation, of multiple approaches.
I have two questions. One was for Shauna. I was just curious with the voice messaging, because this is something that I've experienced, one with pickup rates, if people actually pick up the call, and if you've thought about having a touch tone response that at least there'd be an automated recall and they could touch tone, and then you could also sort of look at, as a separate comment, I'm imagining that for some types of messages, voice messaging and SMS is just fine, and for directions or reminders, it'd be fine. For training, it might be more difficult. So maybe, I don't know how much leeway you have in inducing another treatment in there, but that could be something that would be really valuable, I think, to the RCT community. And then the other one is for Xiao Wei. Well, you don't have to get up, but I was just curious with the Bayesian model, if you included, because presumably, because it's hierarchical, you could include correlations between the species diversity. I don't know, I'm just curious because it seemed like species diversity was the main part of the model, and I was just curious if you attempted to put that into the model, correlations between different species, within your covariance matrix or something like that. That's it.
Yeah, we have interspecific variation among the species as a parameter that in the model. So there was a parameter that accounting for all the species, the variation among species. So, but I didn't show the values of those parameters. I didn't include that part in the presentation. I was afraid it was too big, so. No, it's not published yet, but we are trying to get out a manuscript over this project.
Is there a working paper?
Yes, there's yes. Maybe we can catch, yeah.
Yeah, Shauna, you get the last comment, because we're about to be thrown out.
Oh, go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, I was just talking to a company called Volta. I don't know if you know Volta, but they do voice messaging. And so they are able to capture how long the person listened to the message for. And then afterwards, they have a few questions with Touchstone that you say, for example, did you understand the message? Did you find it useful? So we'll get some feedback along the way, which is really helpful. In terms of adding another arm onto the RCT, I don't know if that's possible, but maybe we should talk about it. Maybe I can see if there's a way to wiggle it in, but obviously power becomes an issue.
Okay, we are over time, and I'm going to be late to something. Thank all the speakers very much for their contribution. Thank the audience, what's left of them. Thanks, Jeff, for staying for longer than he said he was going to. And thank you for all the people who helped organize. We'll do this again next fall, I think, with a partly new group of people and partly remainders from this group. So thank you all, and I'll see you again.